Hi, and welcome to Technically Speaking, a podcast where scientists and engineers come together to chat about a common interest, share knowledge, and satisfy some curiosity. I'm Amina, and in this episode, I'm joined by Laura, Cara, and Antonia to talk about nuclear waste and to offer our viewpoints on how it can be managed. So to start off with, I'm going to pick on Cara. Why do you care about nuclear waste?
So I care about nuclear waste because I spent quite a few years doing research around the social value of nuclear decommissioning, which is the end of life of nuclear power plants. And obviously a big part of that is what happens to the nuclear waste that comes out of those power plants, especially ones which have been around for decades now. They've been producing waste for a long time. So we want to make sure that we have a plan for where that goes to. But the people who I speak to in the industry who are talking about the nuclear waste and what they plan to do with it have spoken about creating a geological disposal facility and finding a community for that in the UK. And they've said actually it'll probably be before, not before they've retired in their current jobs, that they'll even see where this site will be and waste will start going into the ground. That might be kind of exaggerating slightly, but that's kind of how they see things for some of the older people who've been working in this for a long time. This is something which is like really, really long term, and we need to kind of really think about how what we do today is going to affect generations in the future. So it is a real intergenerational issue with lots of social impacts that come out of it. So that's, yeah, I really see the people involved with this as something really interesting.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point of view because not all industries have something like that which affects multi-generations. So it's an important point to raise. And Laura, why do you care about nuclear waste?
For me, I mean, I've been sort of working with it one way or another for over 10 years now, and it's quite an interesting topic. It's also not that well understood, I guess, because it doesn't really come out in the media all that much. A lot of people don't really know what it is. I mean, I was reading an article just yesterday where it started off with "draw me a picture of nuclear waste," and I think the inference was that very few people can, because very few people are familiar with it. And I thought that is actually spot on. I mean, I'm not even sure that I could entirely draw a very good picture of nuclear waste, because you never really get to just like physically handle it and pick it up and do anything with it. It's always like it's this remote thing that doesn't really feature in people's lives all that much.
And it includes a lot of different types of things. So I guess it's one of those things that you can't just pinpoint it and say this is nuclear waste. But there's so many forms of nuclear waste. Antonia, why do you care about nuclear waste?
So I've been looking at sort of the electricity system in the UK and seeing what's sort of feasible from an environmental point of view in the future. So, you know, as we go towards low carbon, we got to use more renewables, and, you know, some particularly environmentalists like Greenpeace might have campaigned against nuclear in the past. And so, you know, looking at environmental impacts on a sort of life cycle basis, does it sort of hold water in the kind of fact-based, if we could quantify the environmental impact? So from my point of view, you know, knowing how the nuclear waste might contribute to nuclear's environmental impact might sort of make or break it as a future energy source.
Yeah, definitely. That's a really interesting point of view. So we have three very varied sort of point of view here. We now know that why everyone's interested in it. So how about we find out more what nuclear waste is? And Laura, would you be the best person for that?
Yeah, I can give you my perspective on it. I guess it's worth pointing out that nuclear waste could be considered as anything that comes from a nuclear licensed site. But it's quite important to realise that not all of the waste that comes from a nuclear site is radioactive, which is usually the main hazard that we associate with nuclear. So some of the waste that comes from a nuclear site comes from places like the canteen or just offices where people do printing and filing and whatever else. And there are also examples like the mud that was removed from Hinkley Point C while it was being constructed, which made the headlines because it was being disposed of in just offshore. But none of it was radioactive, so it could be handled in the same way as general waste.
That's interesting. So when we talk about nuclear waste, is it better to talk about radioactive waste then?
Yeah, that's the general consensus from the regulatory point of view, certainly. I think it's also helpful to look at the history of the nuclear industry, which helps put it in context. The UK has a relatively long nuclear heritage. We were the first nation to produce electricity from a nuclear power station on an industrial scale. And that was in 1956. So, well, certainly longer than I've been alive anyway, so quite a long time ago. Since then, we've built around 20 power stations, and roughly 20% of our electricity comes from nuclear power today. And the nuclear industry is predicted to generate just over 5 million tonnes of radioactive waste over its entire lifetime. And most of that is from the historic operations over the previous 60 years or so. And that amount's quite tiny when you consider that UK households and businesses generate just over 5 million tonnes of hazardous waste every single year. And that the total amount of waste generated by the UK in a single year is 221 million tonnes.
Wow.
And of that, about 27 million tonnes came from just UK households. So even though there's a much smaller amount of radioactive waste generated, it needs to be managed in a different way to general waste, which I guess is quite an important distinction.
Yeah, that's a very important distinction, because I don't think everyone would perhaps think of it that way. And it's really interesting how you're saying how much waste is produced outside of that. The comparison is just, it's staggering, really, how much is actually radioactive then. So how is radioactive waste managed then?
It's kept separate from other types of waste. So it's usually monitored to decide if it is radioactive below or above background levels of radiation, I should say. And it's usually encapsulated in some form of grout or turned into glass, which makes it easier to handle by fixing lots of small items or liquids into a large solid block. It's also usually kept behind some sort of shielding to protect us from the radiation. And like most waste, as Cara mentioned, the plan is to dispose of it responsibly in an underground or a geological disposal facility. And right now it's up to communities to come forward that would be interested in hosting such a facility.
So it's a very well thought out process of how these things need to proceed, I guess. Perhaps on the surface of it, it doesn't really show how much thought is sort of gone into all of this. The waste management facility and everything will get considered in safety case sort of analysis, which is like right at the very beginning before even anything even happens. And I wonder if people think that it comes as an afterthought, like, oh, we've produced all this radioactive waste, now how are we going to manage it? It's really not like that. Like, it's the other way around. Okay, cool. So radioactive waste is managed really carefully, but how do you think that this would affect your community? So say if this was coming into your community, what do you think their concerns would be? Cara?
Oh, I don't know, Laura, you've just said you've packed like loads of numbers into like quite a short piece of time in a really interesting way. So you're making me think about this quite a lot. So that was really helpful, thank you. And it's making me kind of get like super philosophical about this. And I guess it's like, as a community, what do we mean by waste? You know, what do we define as waste? And it's like interesting to say that in the 50s, like we didn't consider radioactive waste in the same way. So in 50 years time, will we again? In 200 years time, how will we redefine it? 50 years ago, we didn't really recycle anything. So and now we do recycle stuff. So what we call, and then moving forwards with the whole circular economy idea, like nothing should even be going to waste at all. So how do we start recycling or repurposing that? So I don't know, there's just so many questions around what we define as waste. So from me talking about the social perspective in terms of a community wanting to kind of consider bringing this into like their area, I've heard it mentioned before that a huge challenge of this is how do you communicate what's underground to somebody in 600 years time? Will you use floppy disks? Will you print it on paper? Will you have like a yellow sign outside? And by calling it something, will it mean the same thing in 600 years time? So to me, that's a really big thing. Is like, how can you tell me you're going to communicate what's buried underneath my house to my great grandkids? And that sounds, it starts to get very philosophical in a way, but it's actually a very valid thing. And actually up on, is it called the Nucleus Archive, which is where they've built the big archive up in the very north coast of Scotland, where they're moving all the archive documents from all nuclear sites as well as other sites around the UK to store them in a really great proper archive facility where it's all paper documents and it's been digitized as well. But things like, I think, is it CDs are like really bad, they degrade really fast, and this is something which is coming around. They don't know what's in Sellafield because the records were so bad. So how do we make sure that what records we have now are going to be good for the future?
Also, just imagining in the future, will we have moved away from CDs, DVDs, USB, the internet? You know, how do we keep that digitally? Hopefully we still speak the same language, but you know, English has also evolved. So yeah, really philosophical questions.
Yeah, language is always evolving, much like nuclear waste. That's how I tend to think of it, because it was changing under its own radiation field. Right?
Oh, I love it. But yeah, you know, we look at the pyramids. We don't know what's in there. They read hieroglyphs. So like, how are we going to communicate to somebody in 10,000 years when they're like digging up and like, oh, we opened this new mine where we dig out these really great resources? I don't know.
Yeah, but how likely is it? So it's going to be what, sort of between what, I want to say, is it 200 meters or more? It could be quite deep, couldn't it? Is it likely that people would be digging down that low to look for minerals if technology is evolving and we should be becoming more efficient at using the resources that we have?
Maybe they'll just get really good at digging deeper and deeper in the future.
Instead of building skyscrapers, we'll be tunneling underground.
Yeah. And so I think actually a good comparison of this is the sites which they're trying to decommission. So sites like Troisfinith it's actually in the middle of Snowdonia National Park. They had planned to leave the nuclear site as it is, close the gates, walk away for 60 years, so everything gets a bit safer, and then they come back and then try and clean it up. And they've actually moved away from this idea now because they've said in 60 years' time, how can we even guarantee that the skill set will still be there, that we will still have that same knowledge a few generations away? And they've said actually we need to manage the risk between what the radioactive risk is now and actually what it, like just shunting that down the line in the future and kind of people not knowing how to deal with it. So I think the GDF, maybe what happens if in 100 years time there's a politician who decides that there's some kind of benefit to them digging things up and moving it somewhere. Don't know. It's basically the uncertainty of humans being weird that we kind of really can't really plan for.
You can't really plan for the future though, can you? I guess that the best thing you can do is act properly according to the information that you have currently. We don't know what kind of facilities are going to be available to us in the future. I mean, we might have far better technology, far better understanding of things, and we might have something even better to do. But we just need to do it to the best of our knowledge, I guess.
Yeah, what I find quite interesting about this discussion is that we're talking about how weird human behaviour is and we can't predict what we'll be doing in the future. But right now, there are like hundreds of researchers around the globe that are working on understanding how the radioactive waste will look as it changes over time and how that will behave in the future. So we seem to be characterising the behaviour of the waste much more thoroughly than we are characterising human behaviour, if you like. Like one of the things we're doing with all that knowledge is figuring out how to make this underground storage facility as sealed and as safe as possible and as far away from people.
We can predict that so much better than we can people's motives changing. Yeah.
So do we know what kind of radiation levels the community could potentially be exposed to, and how the waste will be managed in the future? Do we know anything about that as of just now, like what the plans are?
I think from my days as a nuclear safety consultant, there are definitely calculations done to estimate how much radioactivity will be released from the containers that the waste will be in. And so one of the calculations that's done is they take people that are most likely to be exposed to the waste as it's being transported, is what I was working on because it's quite a while ago. And they take into account like people that hang around train stations quite a lot, which would have been me actually, because I travel on the train a lot and I used to live right next to a train station. And the radiation exposure that you're talking about is very low. You probably get more exposure from traveling on a few transatlantic flights a year.
And I think that's a fair point, that's being able to make those comparisons, communicating it to the people who might want to come forward in the area where they might put the waste to say, okay, well, this is, realistically what you are going to get. But then that becomes the challenge. There's some countries where they have kind of gone ahead and they've identified communities where sometimes it can be kind of accused that you're saying like, oh, the waste isn't that bad. And like, think of all these really great benefits you'll get out of hosting it here, which sounds like you're kind of trying to bargain with them. But the reality is that there will be industrial employment benefits for quite a while. And do you want to put that in the same conversation as what the risk of the radioactivity is, especially the radioactivity is so low, but kind of reiterating that it's so low and it's really safe, maybe kind of draws attention to the wrong thing. It becomes kind of this like balance of what is the most important thing to be communicating to people and which people want to hear what part of the story.
The communication needs to be well managed.
Yeah.
The language. Yeah.
Well managed, but I think no one really knows exactly how to do that yet.
If we backtrack a bit, what sort of volumes of waste would we put in a geological disposal facility?
I don't know what the numbers are, having spouted a load of numbers like relating to tonnage, but the volume is about the same volume as Wembley Stadium.
Oh.
Okay.
Which is kind of impressive to think about if you're excavating a Wembley Stadium several hundred metres underground.
Oh, the one facility will be that size?
I think so, yeah.
Oh, wow.
Well, the waste volumes anyway. I think the idea is there'll be like different sort of caverns holding the different types of waste underground.
Yeah, I've heard of that as well.
And I think there's an idea to sort of segregate it based on how the waste is classified was kind of related to activity content. And I guess, the main reason for doing this is there are lots of really like long-lived radioisotopes that would sort of like be very radioactive for hundreds of thousands of years, and we're putting it underground so it's decayed away after that amount of time.
So are we saying that we're putting sort of high level waste mostly rather than low level waste, and is that also going down in the geological disposal facility?
So there's already a facility to dispose of low level waste. It's on the coast of West Cumbria. And I think the idea is that will decay away relatively quickly. And it's got an awful lot of criteria for what counts as waste that can be disposed of there. And that's been operating for quite a long time.
So the geological disposal facility is basically for the high level waste then?
Yeah, the stuff that would be radioactive for a bit longer and therefore we need to think of like many generations into the future. If this stuff is still radioactive, do we still want future generations to be handling it, or can we deal with it now and get it further away from human exposure? So as like Cara mentioned, sort of retaining skill sets and whatever else, and having communities managing these wastes for decades to come. If we can avoid that, then we probably should, hence the point of geological disposal.
It's an interesting conversation. We went from, well, yes, there's nuclear waste, but then there's different forms of nuclear waste, and what we actually do with all the nuclear waste is dependent on what type of radioactivity it has, essentially. So it's not just that everything that comes out of the power plant is going to be classified as nuclear waste. That could just be classified as regular waste, and that could be managed in a perfectly normal ways. As a parting note, does anybody want to add something?
Haven't really touched on how essential nuclear power is. That, if we did say, okay, even if we don't use any more nuclear power, we still have waste to manage. But also, are we definitely going down the nuclear power route in the future? So, to secure our current energy supply, it seems like across the world that nuclear plays a part. So making sure we manage that waste is essential part of the planning process to make sure it's sustainable for future generations, because the type of power that nuclear plants supply is different from other low carbon energy sources. So, the way solar and wind gives out electricity is not controllable in the same way that nuclear is. And the base load that we have of just needing a certain amount all the time might not always be met by renewables without storage. And storage is quite an expensive avenue right now. And nuclear actually is a cheaper option because we have more experience with it. So I think that could be a point to add into the conversation of how essential nuclear kind of is in our immediate energy supply.
That's a really good point, that it's part of the mix and it's here to stay, so we should do it responsibly.
I think it's a very interesting point Antonia made about it being cheaper, because you often hear it the other way around, that nuclear is really expensive. And I also wonder whether there can be some extra benefit from like the waste and turning it into a product, because you often hear that some of the components in the waste could be used for other purposes. For example, extracting the americium, the radioactive americium isotopes that are in there, and using those to make batteries. You do occasionally hear talk about nuclear-derived batteries. Maybe we could discuss that in a future episode.
Definitely. Repurpose nuclear waste and what that may look like. That could be an interesting podcast.
So it's not called waste anymore.
Yeah,
we're back to your circular economy, nuclear products.
Yeah.
Definitely. We hope that you've enjoyed this podcast, and please contact us through our Twitter handle.
The views expressed in this podcast belong entirely to the person that said them. They do not represent any industry or organisation. If you enjoyed listening to these views, it would really help us out if you could rate us, leave a review and tell a friend. This podcast was sponsored by no one, but if you're interested in funding us to continue to have frank discussions about science and engineering, please get in touch.